Hello and welcome to Hacktivity Explained, the episodes where I look at bugs found by other bug bounty hunters and try and explain them to you in the hopes that you might learn something from them. And in this video we'll be covering two cache poisoning attacks, one of which is more of a denial of service attack and the other is a cross-site scripting into cache poisoning chain, where the cache poisoning attack is actually used to deliver the cross-site scripting attack. I've been meaning to do a lot more research on cache poisoning, and what better way to do that than to make a YouTube video and explain some of the actual cache poisoning attacks, so that me and you might learn a little bit about this very interesting vulnerability. So the first report here is our denial of service attack with cache poisoning, and this was found on a platform called Exodus. So Exodus, I think, is just like a cryptocurrency platform. It's like your classic one, and yeah, basically they have a website, and they also have like mobile applications and a desktop application. So you can obviously download their app from the website, and the way you do that is using this domain downloads.exodus.com, which hosts all the files. So if you visit that domain and you visit like this file here, you'll be able to download it. Pretty straightforward. So these files are actually like behind the scenes are hosted on something called Azure Storage Host. And that's just kind of, I think it's just a Microsoft version of an S3 bucket, kind of very similar. And it's also behind Cloudflare. So basically the way it works is we have Cloudflare here. That's the main kind of thing. Our request comes in here. Then our request is routed to the web server. Here we go. And then finally it's routed to Azure, where the actual files are stored here. That's kind of how it works, right? And in cache poisoning, the vulnerability actually lies here, where Cloudflare is. Cloudflare caches the responses when they're actually static. And in this case, since it's a file and it's unlikely to change, it's pretty much always going to be static. So the developer set up a caching rule to make sure that the responses here get reused. However, when the attacker went to test this for cache poisoning, and they appended a header called authorization, the server gave an interesting response. It gave a 403 response, and that basically is like is an access denied response. So what happened was that the server gave a response that didn't actually include this file. So it gave a response that didn't sort of fetch anything from Azure, and Cloudflare actually stored that response. So even when a subsequent user goes to try and download this file, it won't work because the cache has stored a response, which is actually an access denied response, right? So what this basically means is you can prevent anyone from downloading the Exodus application by just sending this, and then as long as the cache is storing that response, then no one can actually download the file, because they'll just get a 403 request which doesn't include the file in. And apparently that was severe enough to be considered a high, which is interesting, preventing people from downloading the app. I guess it makes sense as it's kind of a denial of service attack that's pretty severe. Maybe you can only use Exodus from the app. I don't actually know, but anyway, there was fixed pretty quickly as well. I don't know what the bounty for this is, but actually maybe you can go check. How much does Exodus pay for this stuff? Probably around 6,000, maybe somewhere between 5 and 6,000. We'll say was the bounty. So that's the first report, and maybe we'll go back to. Here it is. So that was the first report, and the main thing I guess here was that cache poisoning was used in a denial of service way. So I think this is the most common occurrence of cache poisoning, where you can actually prevent someone from accessing a resource. And this can come in a few ways. Like this way here was definitely a little bit unique. Maybe I wouldn't have thought of blocking someone from being able to download something. One of the common ways of doing this though is, for example, if the server is loading a JavaScript file from another website, and you can actually change the host header. So if you see this header here, like this, some websites actually use this to determine which website to load the JavaScript from, right? So they'll append this into the JavaScript, and if you can trick this with like an X forwarded for header instead, then you might be able to cache a response that contains invalid JavaScript. So anyone who actually accesses the website will just get an error. So you can basically like shut down the entire website, which I imagine is actually a fairly severe vulnerability. Because in terms of business impact, you could just like prevent anyone from accessing the service, which could be a very, very lucrative attack for some people. And yeah, this does come with big bounties, as you see. I mean, this is quite a simple vulnerability, but still rewarded high. So there's money to be made in this. Although this is getting a little bit rarer, especially in 2025 when this is pretty known and caches are usually configured better than they were a few years ago. So the main tips, I guess, here is that headers are the big thing when you're dealing with cache poisoning, and you want to try and fuzz headers as much as you can if you're looking for cache poisoning attacks. So yeah, sorry about that. I had to answer the door. So yeah, I was saying fuzzing headers is probably the most important part of cache poisoning, and trying to find ones like these, like the authorization headers, or the X forwarded for headers as well for the cache poisoning on JavaScript. These are going to be like the bread and butter for finding these kind of exploits. And another thing is that a lot of people look for bugs like IDORs, spend ages like trying to find like small access control issues. And I think these kind of problems are actually a lot easier to find. They're a lot less work anyway, and the payout is bigger anyway. So I used to be someone who hunts for a lot of broken access control issues, but I've been kind of stepping into more bugs like these because they're actually, I think, a lot more lucrative than the access control vulnerabilities. Well, anyway, that's up to you, and we'll actually move on to the next report. But before I move on, I just want to say that I've actually created some labs for you, and these are kind of like hands-on practical labs that I've released, and you can buy them from me on Gumroad. And for now, there's 12 labs from the topics of broken access control, race conditions, server-side request forgery, uh, XXE, XML external entities, and then there's one also on large language model exploitation. And I've put these labs together with bugs that I've personally found myself, as well as bugs from reports like these. So they're vulnerabilities that you can actually expect to find in real world applications. So if you want to have a look at those, you can click the link in the description, which will lead you to the page, and then you can try out these labs yourself. So without further ado, we'll also just move on to the next report then. So the next report is our cross-site scripting into web cache poisoning attack, and it was found on this site called Glassdoor. So Glassdoor, I think, is like a social media for like employees, kind of similar to LinkedIn, but more specifically for people who are employed and not for employers, which is interesting. I've never used it, but anyway, one of the endpoints here, you see Glassdoor/job, it allowed parameters to be reflected into the HTML. So what you could basically do is just put like a parameter like this, and then just put a closing tag like this, and then put like a script tag, right? And it was injected inside of a script tag. So first of all, you had to close off the script tag, and then you could write your own HTML, which is a pretty standard cross-site scripting attack. Except that here there was a web application firewall. So it was fairly strict, I think, and it basically prevented you from just putting a whole cross-site scripting payload into the URL parameter. And I think even if you did, then I think modern browsers won't even let you do that. I think in parameters especially. So basically this was a kind of unexploitable cross-site scripting vulnerability because of the WAF and the parameters, but the attacker found a way to actually make it pop. And one of the ways was by putting a cookie and splitting the payload into two, right? So if you had to match this, right? So the URL parameter will say like this, like it was like secret or something like that. And then in the cookie header, he had like a cookie called like test, and the cookie was like this, for example. It was just it was just like a continuation of the payload, right? And then you had something else here, right? So the WAF wouldn't actually detect this as a cross-site scripting vulnerability, a cross-site scripting attack, because it was split in two, right? And when the cookie header and the parameter came together, they actually created this cross-site scripting payload, which could be used to attack the user. But there is an issue, right? We cannot control the, for God's sakes, there is an issue, right? We can't actually control the user's cookies, right? We are not able to set cookies for the user. There's no way you can carry out a cross-site scripting payload with the user's cookies. So this was a self XSS, which is not exploitable, and programs will not accept this as a vulnerability, right? So the attacker had to go on and basically keep attacking and try and deliver this attack with web cache poisoning, which is a very common application of how to use the cache, right? So the idea is, right, when I explained it before, when we have our main server here and we have CloudFront here, the idea is that we can send a request here, which basically makes the server return a cross-site scripting payload, right? And it'll return it to us. But the idea is that CloudFront will say, all right, so I'm going to reuse this request for all the users who have sent that same like request to the same directory, right? So anyone who then visits that directory will receive our cross-site scripting payload. And that's the idea of how we can serve a malicious web page with cache poisoning. So with that basic concept, we can now start looking for directories that basically have very lax caching rules. And the attacker was able to find that in these two directories, which are award and list. So these basically meant that the server would cache all requests that came from these two directories. But these aren't useful because we found our cross-site scripting payload here, or I should say the attacker found it here, right? So we want to somehow convince the server that we're actually sending the request to here, but we want to convince the cache, so like CloudFront here, that this request is actually, this request is actually here, right? We want to do a bit of cache confusion here, right? So the way that the attacker did this is by using path normalization discrepancies. What that means is that when you have a path, so you have something like job, right? And you put like a // here, that basically means that the server goes back, right, to the previous directory. You can try this on your computer actually. If you do like cd .. on your computer, the path directory will go back once. So if you do it from your home, if you do it from like your user directory, you'll go back to home. So that's basically how we can navigate back paths. And when you do it on a website, what sometimes happens is that servers kind of disagree on this, right? So say if we put like job / award, right? Like this. Well, what directory are we actually sending the request to? Well, in this scenario, what the server thought we were sending the request here. It normalized the path and then reflected our payload. But the cache actually thought we were sending the request here, like this. And so it said, okay, so this is a static path and I'm going to cache this, right? So this is a cacheable path. But then when we sent it here, it reflected our XSS payload. So what actually happened was that the cache cached the cross-site scripting attack, and the server thought we were sending the request to a dynamic path, so that's why it outputted it. So this is actually a very common example of how we can use cache poisoning to basically deliver these types of attacks. And you can see that this was found in 2022. So this was, I think, really when cache poisoning started to get really popular. And it's not seen that often now. Now caches are actually a lot safer about trying to normalize these kind of payloads. They're usually configured a lot better for one. and these attacks are becoming harder to exploit, but they're definitely still out there. And probably the hardest bit was getting the actual cross-site scripting payload, and then trying to figure out how to escalate it was the second part. So that's one way that we can sort of deliver this cross-site scripting attack. And I guess one more thing is that XSS and cross-site scripting in headers is actually often missed, especially in places like cookies, where a lot of attackers aren't going to be looking for them because they're always going to be self XSSs, right? So this is actually kind of a, if you find a way to do web cache poisoning, if you think that the website is vulnerable to it, then what you could do is try and actually look for these kind of XSSs where it's in a cookie, because then you know how to escalate it later, right? Where other bug bounty hunters will look at it and say, it's probably not worth looking for a self cross-site scripting in cookies because, well, there's no way to exploit it, right? But here we could be able to exploit it by leveraging cache poisoning. And what I guess you could also do is set up like a match and replace rule. Like I just add a cookie with a cross-site scripting payload and see if anything pops. That could be one as well. And maybe try and do like a callback to your own website. Maybe you can get some blind cross-site scripting as well by accident. Well, if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you get more content like this recommended to you in the future. And the video that will hopefully appear on screen now is the video that the algorithm thinks that you'll really enjoy now. So go check out if that's actually the case. And anyway, thanks for watching and happy hunting.